Hello there. Welcome to my podcast. Today's interviewee is Francis Lickerish. Francis specialises in helping the families of addicts, in helping the families learn how to set boundaries, reclaim their lives, and not be so destroyed or caught up by worrying about the person who's affected by addictions. He's such a level, open-minded person and a joy to speak to, and he really feels that there is not enough out there for the families. So he has specialised in helping the families, helping them to change and adapt their behaviour, which in turn may well help the person who's struggling with addictions, as their worry and their concern may indeed not be supporting that person. So I really loved this interview. It was very healing and supportive, and I hope offers a lot to many who are out there. So I hope you enjoy this, and hope you listen to more. Thank you. Hello, Francis Lickerish. Thank you so much for being with me today. Such a privilege.
Most welcome.
Very kind. And today, obviously, you are famous for being a musician in the Enid and still making music.
I was famous. I don't think I am anymore, Cate. Nobody's ever heard of them anymore. So.
I think some people have heard of them. And I did see you've got a Wikipedia page, so I thought that's impressive.
Thank you.
Yeah, but what we're going to, and the music and the poetry is important, and creative life is very important, but what we're going to talk about today is your work with recovery centers, and also with the families of people who are suffering with addiction or addictive processes or substances or whatever they're suffering with. So maybe you can help me out, Francis. How did you come to be a person who is now an expert with helping people with recovery or addictions, or the families, especially the families of people who are suffering in that way? How did this come about?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I kind of got diverted into it. It's when I was at Clouds. I trained at Clouds.
Clouds House in Wiltshire.
Yeah, and that was my first training anyway. Put it that way. And I kind of was quite influenced by the family counsellor there, a lady called Pippa Clark.
I
don't think she's practicing anymore. And then after a while, I went back to Clouds to work full-time as a therapist, and I became sort of senior therapist, and I became just very interested in working with families there. And so it was that way. And I took over from Pippa running the family program there. And I found, because there's so little support for families and so little understanding for families, that I kind of drifted into that work, and I'm glad I did. Really, it's good.
And that is so significant, isn't it, that you were influenced by Pippa Clark then, and because it's often someone we admire or like,
yes,
that draws us in some way. It could be a musician or a comedian, but it could be a teacher, trainer, or a therapist that
absolutely
go, I really like that opens our heart to a direction. And what is it about families then that?
Well, all kinds of things. First of all, I think families, and I'll put this out there, I think families suffer more than the addicts. I think addiction is more dangerous to the family than it is to the addict. The families are left with all the anxiety, the anger, the shame, all this kind of stuff, and they don't usually resort to serious chemicals or behavior to numb the feelings. And they really do suffer, and there's very little help. I mean, again, this is something, the whole thing is focused on addiction, on the actual addict themselves. It's quite addict-centric. And to be blunt, the addiction treatment industry is quite narcissistic. And so it focuses on the addict, and the addict gets, but the families really struggle. There's very little resource for them, very little support, very little real treatment. And they really do suffer with this. And, let's not mince words. Addiction is quite dangerous. There's the family, and they may be living in Dulwich and be quite well off, and sort of. But then all of a sudden, 4 o'clock in the morning, there's a dealer kicking the door down, out of the blue. And I won't go into this in detail, but on occasion I'm called into a witness for the prosecution in a murder case. So it's a serious business, and the families, they kind of get sidelined and pushed to one side, but they really do struggle. They really do suffer. And there's very little, if you like, resource for them, sadly. It's getting better. It is getting better. Slightly.
So what do you do? What's your involvement with the family?
Right. It's a good question. What I do is help them step out of the kind of the struggle with trying to help, trying to support, trying to fix. The basic premise that I come in with is, all right, I'll do that a different way. Look at it this way. Whenever somebody comes to me for help with somebody in addiction, they always say the same things. I'm here to find out how I can support, help, fix them. If you see what I mean. So the focus is still on the addiction. And my job is little bit by little bit wean them off that preconception, because there is nothing you can do. In other words, it's about me saying, well, how can you help yourself? What do you need? What's it been like for you? What's been your experience? What have you been through? And it's very much that, because there's little anyone can do. I mean, families do what they can. They may pay for treatment, they may do this, but in terms of supporting, caring for addiction, they can't do anything, and they will get dragged into a kind of very dark and difficult dance with the addiction, which will drive them crazy as well, if you see what I mean.
Yes. So do you recommend then the family start to look after themselves and not worry about the addict?
Well, it's very difficult to tell them not to worry about the addict, because that's. But yes, I say, look, take the focus off them and look at you. What are you doing in this? And as things go on, I will kind of point out, look, you've got dragged into a parallel addiction. The addict manages their feelings by drinking, using, acting out, whatever, and the family manage their feelings by fixing, by trying to help, trying to solve problems. And if you're honest with yourself, you're doing this to manage your anxiety, your shame, if you see what I mean. So it's a kind of almost a behavioral addiction.
Yes. And so you might run programs around with addiction centers for the families, and what might happen as a family goes through a program or has counseling with you, what might be possible for the family around all that, I imagine, secrecy, shame, and anxiety. And
what I aim to do is to get them into their own recovery process.
Right.
The typical thing that will happen is somebody will come into a group, let's say, and I say, oh, good evening, Mrs. Watson, how are you? And that will pretty much go like this. How are you, Mrs. Watson? Oh, they're doing well. They haven't had to do and this and that and the other. And they're in the flat that we bought them, but we're a little bit worried. But no. Okay, so that's not what I asked. I asked how you were. And getting somebody to focus on how they are. I mean, it can get ridiculous. I can get, oh, Mrs. Jenkins, what's happening? Oh, we're really worried about him. He's in his flat. We bought him a flat, but his girlfriend's left him, and I don't think he's going to work. And we take him food, and we're trying to give him some money. And this, and I say, yeah, okay. How old is he? Oh, he's 42. And this is what happens. it takes over the addict's life, and it also takes over the family's life. It becomes the organizing principle of the family, and this has real horrible consequences. It can split couples up. The siblings get marginalized. They get resentful. They get angry. Mum and dad are arguing. They're fighting, and it can get really, really difficult. And my goal is to pull people back from that. You know? The addict, let it alone. There's nothing you can do. You are powerless. You know, however difficult that is, you begin to step back and begin to look at yourselves and work on your own recovery from this. I have to do it very carefully. You know, if I go straight in with that, people get really quite upset. So it's a question of weaning people, if you see what I mean. I mean,
What happened? How do they wean?
well, quite often, one thing that happens is that, you know, here's an apparent expert like me giving them a permission to step back, and that can happen. That can be quite useful. You know?
And can they step back?
Well, they can, and they do. Not everyone does, but some. There's an awful lot of how shall I put it? There's a lot of confusion that can get in the way. You know, one thing I often get from parents is they feel terrible because they've caused this. You know, and there, of course, there's the 3 C's of Al-Anon, which are really important. You didn't cause it, you can't control it, you can't cure it. And a lot of families, they were traumatized when they were little. And in the current climate, where there's an awful lot of people, some very good, some not so good, people like Gabor Mate saying, oh, all addiction is caused by trauma, which it isn't. And that's not a helpful thing.
What would you say? That's interesting. What would you say?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Kate, I've been doing this a long time.
Of course, no, it's interesting.
And I can absolutely assure you, if you sit in a therapy group with addicts, just come into a rehab, for example, and you say it's all about trauma, they'll go, okay, so I need to find out what the trauma is before I stop.
Got it.
They will lean on it.
Got it.
It's not useful.
It's trauma's fault.
It's trauma's fault. I'm going to carry on. And when I find out what the trauma is and fix that, then everything will be all right.
Oh, so I can just wait till the trauma gets sorted. No, I'm not going to do anything about it.
Exactly.
Because it's the trauma did it.
Yeah, it's trauma. It's mum. You know, it's dad. It's whatever. It's what happened to me when, you know. So it's not a useful way of looking at things. The crocodile nearest the boat is always the addiction. It doesn't matter. There may be trauma. There may be an ADHD, which everybody seems to have these days. Everybody in the known universe seems to be diagnosed with ADHD, whatever it is. Doesn't matter. And this can really confuse families because they go to see a doctor and the doctor refers them to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist says, oh, yes, their cocaine use is undiagnosed ADHD. Oh, great. So I'll fix the ADHD and everything will be all right then. And it doesn't work that way. So a part of my job is to say, look, this is addiction. There may be ADHD, there may be trauma, there may be bipolar, there may be anxiety, but they are not underlying. You know, it's a question of cause and correlation. They may be run alongside it, but the addiction is a thing of itself. And unless that is dealt with, nothing is going to change. Oh, did
Wow.
that. So yes.
Wow. So what happens next? I mean, do they stop taking food to the flat? Do they stop doing all the things they're doing, or what happens?
They either do that or they vanish from my. They stop coming to group, and and then a year later they'll reappear. You know, saying, "Well, it didn't work." So yes, there's an awful lot of support and help for people suffering with addiction. You know, if the family has money, there's rehabs, there's counsellors, there's therapists who specialise in this. One of the difficulties with addiction, quite often, let's say he's an alcoholic. And why is he drinking? They will ask me. Well, to be blunt, he drinks because he wants to. And it can be that simple. He doesn't want to stop. There's lots of help available. You can go to AA, you can get a therapist. You're willing to pay for him to go into rehab. Doesn't want to. And that's a choice. And he's choosing to drink. What can you do with that? If we take out all the sort of myth about underlying issues, about this and about that, and that if we fix this, everything will be all right. If you take out all that, essentially, your loved one is drinking and using and acting out because that's what they want to do. Now, that sounds very harsh and a bit right-wing, but if you go down the other routes, trying to fix the trauma, trying to fix the ADHD, it will just keep going.
And if you look at it like it's a choice, what happens with the family and with the person in addiction? What happens when they can get that on board, that this is a choice and there are options and it's this person's choice and they're not a victim of all their circumstances, but they're making a choice? What happens?
It can change the dynamic very drastically. And quite often the family get really quite angry. Well, how dare they? Who do they think they are? Which is not a bad position, to be honest, for the family. I know, I'm aware I'm sounding very hard. I'm not. It has, if you think about it, eventually, beyond us, when the addict gets to a certain point, it has to be a choice. If it wasn't a choice, no addict or alcoholic on the planet would ever survive.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
It wasn't a choice, ultimately. If it wasn't an individual choice, if it wasn't a choice of the addict or the alcoholic to use or not, if it was all, they are victims, they are prey to all this external, they'd all be dead. We would all, well, I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic. I chose to stop drinking. I chose to stop using. If I hadn't have done that, I'd be dead. If it had been outside circumstances, if it had been anything else, it would have killed me. You see what I mean?
So help me out a little bit more. Do you mean, but there are addicts who will live till the end of their days, but they're still addicts, but they're risking their lives all the time?
Yes.
So
that's their choice. They can choose not to stop.
They can choose.
Yeah. Why not? I mean,
So what stops someone choosing? Do you see what I mean? What?
They don't want to.
They don't.
Pragmatically,
yeah,
they want to carry on drinking. They want to carry on using.
Because somewhere that works for them.
Yes. And they have that right.
And what about also, like the DSM, the diagnostic materials don't even like the word addiction now. They use different language, and a lot of therapists don't like the word addiction.
No. It doesn't really matter. I mean, for me, I don't, fair enough, you don't like the word addiction. Okay, but you're taking a lot of drugs and drinking a lot of alcohol and it's wrecking your life. It doesn't really matter what we call it.
No. So, because, some people say, oh, it's pathologizing people doing all kinds of things. Well, like, it's
that's up to them. I mean, it's not a moral issue. If somebody wants to drink and wants to take drugs, great. But if I'm working with a family saying, well, that's what they're choosing, what do you want to do? You get on, they're getting on with their life and living it how they want to. So you get on with yours and live it how you want to.
So if somebody had a relative and it seems like they are in suicidal addiction, as in they're drinking so much or drugging so much or eating so much or whatever it is, so much that they're pushing themselves to death, would you recommend the family just step away and let them.
I can't be global about that. It very much depends on what's going on.
Yeah, it depends on every situation. Yeah.
I would recommend that the family try some kind, change the dynamic and try some sort of way of intervening. It's not helping or supporting or not, but being very clear on their position. In other words,
which is
we can't help you.
Yeah. So you need to help. You need to see what you want, kind of thing.
And then you're in kind of what you might call intervention territory, where you're saying, we can't do this anymore. We love you, we care about you, we really miss you. We're in terrible pain, and your behaviour is hurting us, and we're in dreadful pain because basically of your affliction. We ask you to get help. If you can't get help, we have to look after ourselves. If you won't get help.
Yeah, so setting limits, which maybe no one's done for that person. Putting boundaries in. Yeah.
Ultimately, the family can't save them.
No. And it's funny, I met someone at a bus stop once, and she said, it's really strange, but my two daughters are functioning and fine and got jobs and everything. And my son, who's in his 50s, is alcoholic. And I said, and how do you treat your son? Well, I just give him money, and I give him this, and I look after him. And I said, have you thought there's any link with you continuing to always do stuff for him? And she said, but I adore my son, And I just thought maybe that's also part of the dynamic, maybe.
It very much is. And I will say this to families, they don't like me for it, but I will say, whether you believe it or not, and whether you're aware of it or not, the family will have an investment in keeping the addiction going because it's useful.
What is it useful for?
Well, let's say mum and dad aren't getting on very well. Right? The relationship, they've been married a long time. Tim, who's 20, he's an addict. He lives at home. Mum looks after him. She takes care of him. She does all this, right? The only time that mum and dad talk about anything is when they're talking about Tim. The only time they do anything is when they're rescuing Tim. All the other children have gone. In fact, one of them has vanished. They don't know where he is. He's become what we call a lost child. Now, as long as the drama of Tim is in the family, mum and dad don't have to look at their relationship. They don't have to face the fact that all the children have grown up. Mum doesn't have to deal with what is actually called quite glibly an empty nest syndrome, but is actually really quite powerful. There's all kinds of things that the drama of addiction is covering up. And if the drama goes, they're going to have to deal with this. Do you see what I mean?
Totally. Yeah.
And so that the addiction is serving a real purpose for the whole family. In other words, it's covering up all kinds of things. Quite a lot of marriages, let's say a couple are married and he's an alcoholic or a drug addict, he gets into recovery and the marriage splits up because the glue of addiction isn't there anymore.
Yeah, because the way they relate. But what about families when, let's say, the son is an alcoholic and the parents had that dynamic, and now one parent's died and one parent's ill? What then? And there's no longer the family rescuing because there's no one to rescue, but the person's...
the family dynamic is still... Families are very, very strange creatures.
Right.
But the family dynamic is still there internally. I mean, you have an external family and you have an internal family.
Yes. So that's kept going unless you address that.
Unless you deal with it.
Unless you address it and externalize it and retell the story, you're living in the same dynamic, even if the parents have gone. The same dynamics continuing, right?
I mean, if you think about it this way, when you're born, when anyone is born, they are given a big bag of stuff. And this big bag of stuff has been handed down the generations. We are a working class family. We do this, we think this, we believe this, we vote like this, we read these newspapers. And all this is in this big bag of stuff. And the thing about this big bag of stuff, it is very important and it is always right. we're a legal family, so you're going to be a barrister. But I don't want to be a barrister. But your father's a QC, his father was a QC, his father was a judge. There's a picture of his great-great-grandfather in the Law Society that was painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And you're going to go to this school where they train barristers, and then you're going to go into this. But I want to know. And I have actually seen that family dynamic kill people.
Because they become an alcoholic rather than become the barrister.
Their only recourse is to disappear into something.
Like drugs or alcohol or food or whatever.
Even suicide. I've known one young man walk off Beachy Head.
Oh.
And there's a whole pan to it. I'm sorry.
No.
Families can be wonderful, but they're not automatically and mechanically wonderful. There's a lot of myth about families. Families can be deadly.
Yeah.
If a family works on itself and becomes consciously loving, then it can be a wonderful thing.
Yeah, of course.
Automatically assumes that family is everything, then it can be very dangerous.
If, let's say, someone came from an alcoholic family, let's say the mother or the father were alcoholic, and let's just say the mother or father, one parent was very Al-Anonic, the other one was alcoholic, let's just say, but it was part of the family system and they were laughing away. But let's say one of the children, it looked like theirs was becoming a problem in a way that the family were concerned about.
Yes.
But they didn't see their behavior, the father or the mother's behavior. They just would only focus, let's say, on the son or the daughter. And so they don't see all their anxiety or the pattern. They just see they're the black sheep, they're the wrong one, even though there's plenty of addiction or alcoholism, let's say, through the entire family, let's just say, but it's not seen. It's only that son or that daughter. They are the ones, which, like you said, it can be useful, can't it? Well, they are the ones.
Yes.
How does that person, so in a way they're propping up the family system by being an addict as well, because it's part of maybe the whole system, them being a problem, them being the scapegoat, them being the black sheep or whatever the name is. And they can never get out of it, maybe because they're just people enjoy them being the victim and they enjoy being the victim, and it's cyclical. And they lean in and the family rescue them and then tell them they're an idiot and rescue them. And, how does that person get out of it? Even if maybe, like you said, it's internalized after a while, it's internalized that this is how they operate.
They get out of it by getting into another system.
Right.
Now, that can be quite difficult because, one thing that perhaps may not be obvious is the scapegoat, the person in that position may think, well, I can't stop drinking because if I stop drinking, my family's going to fall apart. That's not a cognitive thing, but it's in the pre-conscious, well, I'm the thing that's keeping my family together, so I better keep going. This is where AA and NA can become very useful because they provided almost another family system, which has a very different dynamic. And it doesn't, I need to be careful what I say. AA is a very, very weird organization. And I think in the early days of recovery, it's very, very useful and almost essential. But I do think it can lock you into something which is quite pathological if after a while. However, in the early days, and I don't care if people go to AA, I don't care if they get a sponsor or they work the 12 steps or anything. I'm not interested in any of that. If they want to, fine. If they don't, I don't even care if they stand up and say, I'm so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic. I'm not worried about that. If somebody I will encourage people to go to AA because it provides a different system. There is a different dynamic, and over time that different dynamic can take over from the older one. This is what I'm concerned with people going to AA. All the rest is fine, and if you want to do that, I'm a big fan of some of the 12 steps. Some of them I think are nonsense. I'm sorry, this is heresy, isn't it?
No, it's interesting, yeah.
But I think it's very, very useful in terms of it provides almost another family dynamic.
it makes a lot of sense, because as humans we need to belong, and as humans we need connection. And
Exactly.
if you have a family, that's often the immediate place. But if you can create another kind of family and compatriots that you do let in, that you do let them know what's going on for you, you could have a different experience.
Absolutely
Especially if
right.
the first one is quite pathological, and your role has been so set, you could have another experience where your role shifts. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that
And
would be transformational. Yeah.
and that is the main thing that can happen in rehab, is that the experience of group therapy, you can actually step out of the shame, the guilt, and so on, and take risks. And as you absolutely rightly said, you can connect. You can make real connections with other people, and that
And
is very.
that's very, and I imagine as well, safer. You potentially, not all, nothing's safe, right? Everything can trigger us, but there could be, you could be vulnerable, or you could help someone out, or whatever, and you're not quite in the same roles that you've been in. You've got a chance to have a different story.
Absolutely, and that's very important. Very important. And for me, it's the great blessing of AA. And don't get me wrong, I'm not. I may sound like I'm anti them, but not at all. I think they are wonderful organisations, and they are everywhere, and they save lives. But there comes a time when they start to work against you, I think.
No, it's interesting. It's like, I remember reading that, people said, if you've been an addict and you've spent all day, let's say a heroin addict, and you spent all day scoring being sick, scoring being sick, scoring being sick, getting money, scoring being sick, that it's essential, to replace that with daily meetings, to kind of replace your habit, as you have a transition. But then potentially there's after, and it might be years, that people need daily meetings in order to replace the habit. But then after a while, you want to also develop and create your internal world in such a way where you create a life that's different, that isn't based on these rigid structures just to manage life, but starts to actually have a different internal experience of living. Yeah. And so not to be based around rigid structures, which that could be in that way, not that it's not useful and helpful, it is, but kind of like, where are you, and how are you developing your parts that you want to live, how you want to live. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's absolutely it. You don't want to spend your life on life support if you
That's
don't
it.
have to.
That's it. So what would your idea of health, emotional health, be? And how could that be? And how could that be more flexible? Maybe that goes back to the trauma thing, that, if it is trauma, and there's a rigid way of living. I remember, Nick Cave was interviewed on Louis Theroux recently, and he said that heroin gave him a structure to his day, so that he worked while he was on heroin, and then he was sick for the rest of the day, and then he was scoring, and then he would work. And so it gave him this until he got married, and his wife said, that doesn't sound great. And he stopped.
Yeah.
And he still kept his rhythm of working, but he stopped using heroin.
Absolutely. It's yes. And I don't know if I should say this, but from my own personal experience, I think if I hadn't have been an alcoholic and an addict, I would have committed suicide.
Because it soothed, it softened, what?
It numbed me enough. It was kind of like the anaesthetic that in a sense, and this is a weird way of thinking, I know, but I think a lot of people would agree with me. It kept me alive long until I had the strength to be able to deal with my own hurt.
No, it makes a lot of sense, because I talked to someone who was a heroin addict, who, same thing, he said to me, he was a heroin addict until he didn't need to be, until he could then manage to have different choices. And he was from Scotland, but he was in Sydney, Australia, homeless on the street, being treated very badly, extremely badly. And someone put a card in his hand of a rehab centre, and somehow that was the moment where he went, okay. But before that,
Right.
he wasn't. No.
I love those stories. Something other intervenes when the time is right.
And he was ready, but before that, it was almost like he had to be he had to be a heroin addict on the street till that time. So yeah, we need what we need till we don't need it, even if that's not ideal.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yes.
And it creates a buffer.
There
But
is a
actually,
sorry, no, you carry on.
there's incredible survival mechanisms in people.
Oh,
And I
yes.
suppose when the family are rescuing, they're not, in a way, allowing that person to find their own survival and their own choices and their own.
And there's always a process to things, you know. Things happen when and if they are supposed to happen. I'm a great believer in that, you know. Great believer in that. So yes, and the family can really, I mean, I understand it, and there seems to be something about parenting these days where parents let go of their children much later, if they do at all. You know, I often ask the families, you know, well, how much contact did you have with your mother when you were 22? She said, none at all. I didn't tell her anything. Yeah, but your son is living with you. You know, something has shifted in the world where children, I suppose, they're kept helpless longer. I don't blame parents. I think it's in society. I think there's such a pressure on parents to be perfect.
Yes, and it's a new idea, isn't it, that children have feelings and babies have feelings. You know, there was an idea where they did operations on babies without anesthetic, you know, because there was a thought that babies didn't feel. They were, you know, whereas I remember, you know, I had a couple of significant deaths when I was young, very young, and they weren't actually discussed with me because there was a thought you didn't discuss death with children, which I don't think is so common now, but it really was quite thought you protected. My mother wasn't told her grandparents had died. They just buried them. She was really close to these grandparents, and then she kind of wondered where they were. They'd died and were buried while she was away, but somehow they just, you know, people got on with it rather than letting her know her, you know. So whereas nowadays, I mean, maybe that would still happen, but it seems like that would. But there's exactly, people are very anxious around.
Yes.
And like you've talked before with me about the phone and screens and all these things, there's quite a lot of anxiety about letting children be free, and then a lot of phones and screens, which you've said to me, this, I think you've said this, you feel this is kind of the worst of addictions, the phones. Maybe
it's an epidemic waiting to happen.
Yeah.
And I wonder what ADHD really is.
Do you think it's maybe the phone?
I don't know, but I think it's very strange that pretty well every family I come across with a young person, they've been diagnosed with ADHD. Something's going on. I mean, when I was at school, and I mean, you know, whether I would have it or not, I don't know. Whatever it is, I mean, it wasn't available. You couldn't have ADHD. You were just a problem child. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it wasn't available then. There was no such thing.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting because people did name things, but they named things differently, didn't they? Like PTSD, you know, in the First World War, they did talk about the trauma of people who'd come out of the war. They did talk about these kind of shocks that people had, but it's now, we've got different names, haven't we, for all these different things. So, because people have said, are there more mental health issues? I'm thinking maybe they're named more. It's not like people didn't have them. Which reminds me, so what happens with, you know, because we're in the modern era of many modalities to help trauma now. So what happens with that around addiction and around the families?
I think it's an important question. There's two things I believe. I mean, I do trauma work as well. And it has to be dealt with. Not as a cause of addiction, but as a sort of almost a subsequent recovery. And trauma is transgenerational, and it can be very, very unobvious. I think things that are traumatic that don't appear to be. I mean, classic one that I often come across is, let's say you've got a family and they went through, like my parents did, they went through the Great Depression, they went through the Second World War, they had no help, no support. That trauma is still in the mix, and it gets handed on to me. I went to a grammar school where I was beaten, abused, screamed at, this was in the 60s. In a standard process, I was caned regularly, I was abused, punched, groped, all kinds of things. Nobody batted an eyelid. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that was a good thing at all, but, and I left school very, very angry. Then I realized that anger wasn't mine, didn't belong to me. What had happened is these men, the masters at the school, have been through the Depression, they've been through a war, they've been through all kinds of traumas. They'd had no help, no support. They were very frightened, angry men, and there was nowhere for that fear and anger to go except onto us. And this is what I mean by transgenerational. And when I realized that I was carrying their anger and their fear for them, I could let it go. I could begin to see it. And also I could begin to understand them and let them off the hook and not blame them. Poor blokes, they'd been through things which I had no idea. I couldn't imagine what it was like. I mean, one of the chaps was in a tank in the Second World War. I mean, he wouldn't talk about it. We just knew he was in a tank regiment, and they were also, and so, do you see what I mean? And so it becomes transgenerational, and I can heal it in me.
How did you heal it in you?
Well, first of all, by acknowledging it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a weird, I find it very weird, and it's something I find with clients who I'm working with trauma, is that when they realize that what they're carrying isn't theirs.
Yes.
It doesn't belong to them. It's just been downloaded.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then there's if I let it go, who am I? That can get a bit strange. But
yeah,
my view on trauma is it needs to be worked through, and then there comes a point where we have to let it go.
And how do you let it go?
Well, that's up to you.
Mm.
Forgiveness is really letting go. It's just saying, right, okay, I'm done with that now. I don't have to live in that. Some people don't, and some people will live in the trauma and weaponize it. They will weaponize it and use it as a way of manipulating others.
Mm.
You don't understand me. You don't understand how traumatized I was as a child. Well, yes, I do. Well, you don't. You can't possibly. So, and this is what I mean by weaponizing it.
And what about the addict who's like, I had a fine childhood. Everything's fine. I just can't stop drinking, or I can't stop drugging, or I can't.
It very much depends on where they're at. In the early stages, okay, fine. Fine. You had a fine childhood. It's not about trauma. Then okay, let's see. Let's stop drinking. Let's stop taking drugs. And then see. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
But trauma can be very strange. In my view, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm waffling here.
Oh, lovely. Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
For example, somebody, I had a perfect childhood. It was lovely. Elton John came and sang at my 7th birthday. And I'm thinking, what? Whose was that about? Whose childhood was it really? You see what I mean?
Very good. Yeah.
And that's a very subtle sort of trauma. I mean, it's understandable where the parents have been so traumatized. Right, we've got nothing to do with that. We're going to create the perfect family, and by God, you're going to comply with that.
No, that's very good, because it's the lens. You did have a perfect childhood. You did have a perfect childhood, which is different than the lens of it was a bit chaotic. Oh my God. It's quite, there's a lens, isn't there? We made it good for you, and don't you dare say it wasn't.
Exactly. And we did that for us, not for you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not blame. It's not. I mean, my parents, God bless them, were mad as they were crazy. They were in and out of psychiatric hospitals. They were angry, bizarre, but they did the best they could. Bless them, and they did. They did what they could with what they had.
Yeah.
Yeah, they screwed me right up. Okay, fine. That's all right. It wasn't their fault.
Now, is that different if you felt, not you, but a person felt it was the parents' fault? Where
it can't.
No.
And it's a process. Somebody may need to feel that. I mean, I wouldn't never wade straight in, but
yeah,
the thing about blame is it serves no useful purpose
not
whatsoever.
helpful. Yeah.
Well, it's worse than not helpful. It's actually destructive.
Yeah.
On both counts. It
Yeah,
doesn't help.
Yeah. So in some ways, I mean, obviously it's not helpful, but are there kind of pathological kind of parents who are really evil, if you like, that people need to go, that was evil and that was bad? Yeah.
Quite rare.
Yes. Most people are confused and not very well.
But yes, there is. I do think there is genuine evil.
Yeah.
And that's what that is. And you just, well, you have to forgive it, but there it is. It's very, very uncommon. I mean, I do every so often come across a client who's just a wrong one, and that's it. There's something strange about it, and there's a very weird energy about those people. Very strange. So yes, one does come across what I would call objective evil.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, when you do the family groups, I understand from systemic family work, that they'll bring the whole family in. Is that what you do? And they'll let the whole family kind of speak. Is that how it works? Or might you have just the parents? Or yeah.
I used to do that a lot when I was I was manager of a rehab called Farm Place. It's actually very good rehab, and I used to run family programs there when I would do that. And there are still some good rehabs that do that when they bring the whole family in. Everybody has a voice. It's not that common anymore.
Right.
But no, now I mostly just work with the families.
Do you mean parents and siblings?
Yes, and not the identified addict so much.
They're not in the room. No.
No, and it's not helpful if they are, because they will just take over unless if you know.
Yeah, so it's quite a unique thing that you're bringing this kind of calm, peaceful light to a group that are so worried.
Yeah.
It's quite in so much pain, and also so frightened to move and get it wrong, and so they probably are getting it wrong all the time.
Exactly.
It's quite a unique voice, this voice of it's a choice. They have a choice. It could change. You could tell them, you could stop worrying. This is quite a unique perspective, isn't it? In especially in the current era of things being more sensitive or sensitized or whatever. It's quite a unique sort of frame.
It is, and it gives parents permission to not be completely responsible for what's happened. The phrase I often use is, well, your child has their own contract with the cosmos.
Yeah.
They are who they are. It is their life. And that, sorry, but that's nothing to do with you. I don't, it really is not your business. It's difficult. I mean, some parents just really want to hang on, and then you get into cultural difficulties as well. For example, Asian families, Greek families are terrible. Sorry, for just hanging on, and that's cultural. It's Italian. Don't get me wrong, no means am I racist, but it is a cultural fact that certain families find it much harder to let go because of the culture.
Because we're all in this together. We're all in this together kind of thing. Yeah.
It's that job to fix, but it isn't. We can't. You can't.
Can you challenge those cultural norms? Yeah. Yeah.
To do it quite a lot of the time, quite gently.
Yeah.
And it takes time.
Yeah. Because it's the interpretation of love, isn't it? You know, it's
very much so. It's not coming from a bad place. It's just very, very misguided.
And it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? It makes a lot of sense why people would cover up their addictions as well, then, from certain backgrounds, and not really reveal maybe what is really going on for them if they're feeling like got to show a certain face to their family. Maybe
it's not safe. Yes,
not safe to kind of go, actually I'm struggling, and maybe the addiction then is supporting them to hold the face up with the family. Maybe
it may be the only thing they've got,
which is tough if it's all about the group.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, that's about it. But it is, yes, as you say, thank you for saying that. It is in some senses a unique voice, because I'm saying exactly the opposite to what people expect me to say.
Well, it's so helpful because, of course, if someone feels someone's suicidal or they're killing themselves with drugs, alcohol, food, or processes, or whatever it is, people feel they're in an emergency to help, whereas actually maybe they need to step back, give the person space, maybe.
Yes.
Depending, but like you said, it depends.
It's not giving the person space. It's not about the person. You see, this is what always happens.
Oh, of course.
It's about them.
It's about giving themselves space.
We're not trying to fix the addiction.
Yeah, of course.
And that always happens. It's symptomatic. It's fascinating to see it.
Of course. It's like, I suppose, that determinism thing. It's like they're trying to push the river with their own hands.
Yes. Exactly, absolutely.
Whereas actually it's like, no, come back to you. Get out of the river, go on the bank, come back to you and check in where you are.
That's exactly what it is. And if you want to help, work on yourself. It's the best thing you can do for anyone. Is work on you.
And what if they have got a flat for the young person and they're putting the food in the flat? Should they stop putting the food in the flat? Should they readdress the flat?
Eventually, yes. I mean, I have worked with families, but that might take a couple of years to get to that point where you say, well, we've stopped them and we've bloody well evicted from the flat because they made such a mess. And they get to that point, that's getting healthy.
Right.
Whereas before, mum was going in, feeding him, cleaning up the flat. They were really worried, giving him enough money and so on, buying him cigarettes and so on. And you can get to the point where you say, I'm really angry at the mess he's made in that flat. We bought him that. He's not taking care of it, which is great. Now we're getting into a real
relationship. This is real connection. Ow, that hurts. You're not treating me right. Rather than, he might die. If I say anything wrong, he might die. It starts to actually be real. And he might die, of course. They might get into real relationship and he might die. It's a risk.
You might. I mean, that happens.
It does happen.
And
but they've risked being real. And maybe it's the first time in all those people's lives because of their history or their caregivers or whatever happened, like you said, the transgenerational trauma, maybe they never risked being real and they're trying to mend their childhoods by being anxiously attached to their child, maybe.
Absolutely. All kinds of stuff in
all
the
of that stuff. All of that stuff.
Which is what I mean when I say, if you really want to help, work on yourself.
Yeah, if you get calm, there's the thing, isn't it, in therapy, that it's the vocal tone embodiment and the slight happy voice in a firm but consistent way out of the drama triangle, but into a kind of more confident place, which is what that refreshing voice of yours to say, no, it's a choice. No, it's this kind of calm, boundaried, but appreciative voice, which is maybe the potential of those families to develop, rather than anxious or angry, or their nervous system in a heightened or dampened, frightened way. It's the change, isn't it, to being a real person?
Absolutely. It's a change of breaking out of the very dark spell that addiction puts on everyone. It is
A
literally,
dark spell.
I often see it as breaking a spell. I often say to people, I wish I was working in the 12th century, then I could talk about demonic possession, because it's more like that than anything else.
Well, that is interesting, isn't it? Because when you drinking a lot or drugging a lot or anything a lot, you're not very safe. You're very wide open, aren't you? And it can look like some kind of, it doesn't, they don't, because you can see that when alcoholics after 6 months come off alcohol and they're this whole kind of refreshed person, and the person before did it a lot. It does look like not great stuff's going on, and they look like they're open to not great stuff. Yeah.
And if you go to India, they'll talk about alcohol opens the gates of Shiva in the back of the head and allows all kinds of what they would call asuras in to take possession. So
Wow.
they're much open about it there. Asuras are demons, by the way.
Wow. So
It's not a good idea to talk about that too much in
no,
Western psychotherapy.
no, no. But so is this are there many people like you, or is this a fairly unique thing?
I don't know, Cate. I mean, I don't think there's that many.
Right.
I think an awful lot of family groups are still very much addict centric.
Right.
They're about covertly even how can we help them, and it certainly is in addiction centres. It's about getting the family in to support the treatment, which is not, and I'm not interested in that. I get a bit cross with it because, and I will often say to families, okay, so they're in early recovery, they come and they're likely to be as obsessed with AA and their own recovery as everything else. That's okay, but don't let them push it on you. So they come skipping out of an AA meeting after 6 weeks with a key ring saying, and my response is, okay, so you've managed to stop behaving like a complete arsehole for 6 weeks. Good for you. Where's my key ring?
This is so interesting. So again, it's level, no songing, dancing, no kind of drama with the addiction, and no kind of drama with you're off addiction. Just kind of like treat them as a person, treat yourself as a person, just keep a sense of kind of normality, keep a kind of regular sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very interesting.
And it's not unprecedented. I mean, if you read the AA Big Book,
yeah,
look, that's very like that.
It is.
So just
yeah,
big deal.
It's true. But it is really interesting with like Gabor Mate going, every addict, it's trauma, but the thing is, there are some people who out there who speak and say, look, most people need a bit of recovery, but only certain people will go and take it. And even if you took it to them, they're not going to take it.
No, they don't want to.
They don't want to.
And
So
ultimately, it does boil down to that.
you have to want to.
Well, you have to want to. You have to be willing to want to.
You don't actually have to even get to the want to. You have to be willing to even consider to want to. You have to have the window, that doorway. Yeah.
If you step through that doorway and you take it at least a little bit seriously, the process will make you want to.
Yeah, that's
because
right.
life will just improve.
Yes. So it's that incremental,
Yes.
small stages, and then the change is possible. Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you, Francis. Absolutely wonderful to chat to you. Amazing. So that was Francis Lickerish. What a beautiful person. So calm and level, and just the right person to reach out to if you're feeling you don't know what to do about someone, or you want him to speak to someone who's in a real pickle. He's a really great guy. So I hope you really enjoyed that, and look forward to having and sharing more podcasts with you. Thanks.